Hello all, David Herle here, and welcome to a very special edition of the Herle Burly. If you're new to the program, we like to think of the Herle Burly as a commotion of insights and arguments about politics, culture, music, and sports. I think we're the only podcast in Canada with a host who's advised Liberal prime ministers and premiers, but still can't understand how Billy Joel is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when he's really a writer of show tunes. Today on the pod, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome political commentator, Pulitzer Prize winner, Chicago Cubs fan, and the man whom the Wall Street Journal called perhaps the most powerful journalist in America, George Will. Mr. Will has a new book called The Conservative Sensibility. We're going to talk about the book and the state of conservatism today in the United States, as well as the Republican Party, President Trump, and a bunch of other topics that pop up consistently here on the pod. Mr. Will, welcome to the Herle Burly.
Glad to be with you.
How do you define a conservative? In Canada here, we've got a conservative party, and I think a lot of people think about conservatism in partisan terms, but you're not a partisan conservative, you're an intellectual conservative. So what does it mean to you?
An American conservative wants to conserve the American founding. Now, that doesn't exclude Canadians, because the American founding is the natural rights doctrine that limits government, the belief that first come rights and then comes government, that government is inherently limited by the fixity of natural rights and the fixity of human nature, and that we are well served by dispersing power among rival institutions in government. It's a way of keeping government in check so that the large space for the market to work, for the institutions of civil society to do their creative functioning.
And your book is called The Conservative Sensibility. What is the sensibility on the part of the person?
Well, by sensibility, I mean more than an attitude, but less than an agenda. I'm not interested in telling people what to think, but to suggesting how they should think about government interventions in a complex society. The progressives in our country seem to believe that the more complicated society gets, the more government ought to regulate it. And that's explicitly what Woodrow Wilson and subsequent progressives have said. Actually, the reverse is the case. The more complicated society gets, the more government interventions in society are apt to vindicate the law of unintended consequences, which, of course, is that the unintended consequences of large interventions in complex societies are apt to be larger than and opposite to the intended consequences.
Well, Mr. Will, I can't hear you say that and not have climate change come to mind. It's not exactly at the point in the interview when I wanted to get into this with you, but I'm somebody that's quite alarmed by climate change, and I've yet to find a partisan conservative perspective on climate change that isn't really composed of science denial and short-term political advantage. But any attempt to do something about climate change would be the kind of thing you were just describing. It would be a massive governmental engagement across jurisdictions to try to change behavior. It feels necessary.
Well, it may feel necessary, and it might even be necessary, but I do note, as you suggest, that there's a curious coincidence between the timeless aspirations of the left and the contemporary aspirations of the environmental movement and the climate change people. This is what I think. The one thing we can all agree on, the place we can all begin with, is, of course, the climate is changing. It always has been. I grew up in central Illinois, which at one point in its geologic history was under about 50 feet of ice. The question is, and here's where climate science becomes extremely complex, how do we sort out the human effects, which of course are real, from those of solar effects and the resilience of the planet and all the rest? I think we do not know enough at this point to embark on multi-trillion-dollar expenditures and vast excisions from our freedom and enormous expansions of the regulatory agenda of the government on the basis of climate science that is far from settled. I am so amazed at people who say, those of us who take a more tentative approach to climate change are denying science, because when they say it's settled science, I don't know what a settled science is. I think it's not a science.
But it's as close to a consensus among scientists as you could find on a subject, isn't it?
There is a consensus that there is a human effect on the climate. There is far from a consensus about the models that project into the future about what this is going to mean.
Okay. Is it prudent not to act?
It is prudent not to undertake, as I say, enormous expenditures and enormous excisions from our zones of sovereignty as individuals on the basis of models that have in the past, to say no more, a spotty record of predicting the future. If you go back and look, say, 20 years ago at the projections of what was going to happen within 20 years, they were wrong. And I think we ought to all be pleased that they were wrong, but we ought to learn from the mistakes of the modelers.
Okay, let's get back to the book for a second. Why did you feel the need to write this book? Who's it for? What are you trying to do?
It's for, on the one hand, conservatives to realize that there is an enormous intellectual pedigree stretching back to Madison and all the way to Locke behind the conservative idea of limited government and natural rights. It's also important for my progressive friends to understand the following. In 1964, when I cast my first presidential vote for Barry Goldwater, in 1964, 77% of the American people said they trusted the government to do the right thing all the time or almost all the time. Today, that number is 17%. That's a 60% collapse in confidence in government. Now, the entire progressive agenda depends upon strong government. And strong government, at the end of the day, depends on confidence in government. So I would think progressives would want to know how things have gone wrong, because they have a great stake in reversing this collapse of confidence.
Absolutely. And one of the things that progressives need to think about is how often government is effective and whether the delivery is effective. You can't advocate for an active government and not care about whether or not government's competent at what it does.
Exactly.
But a lot of that decline in trust happened in the 10 years after you cast your first vote between Vietnam and Watergate, right?
It did indeed, and it was the Great Society, which promised enormous changes in society and was accompanied by a decline of civil order, an enormous increase in family disintegration, and a tangle of pathologies.
Did the Republican Party, I mean, you have left the Republican Party, so little does it represent this idea now, but did the Republican Party ever represent this idea?
Yes, it did. The Republican Party has been divided over the years often. In 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt decided he wanted to get back into the White House, he challenged the incumbent Republican president, his colleague, William Howard Taft. And the progressive versus conservative split within the Republican Party went on for a long time. It was Dewey, New York Governor Dewey, against Ohio Senator Robert Taft in the 1940s. In the 1960s, it was Goldwater Republicans against the Rockefeller Republicans. What's new today is there's no split in the Republican Party. It's more homogenous than it has ever been in its history that began in the middle of the 1850s. The Republican Party today is Trump's party, period, and there is no dissent.
And but Trump's only been around for a couple of years. I mean, the weakening of Congress and the weakening of Republicans in Congress. I mean, let's start with an observation. You've been watching this for a long time now. Are the quality of the people the same as they used to be?
I don't know. I'm a little reluctant to sound like a curmudgeon saying, "Oh gosh, things were wonderful in the salad days of yore." I do think that there is a decline in the quality of legislators in two senses. First, they do not think of themselves as legislators representing an independent branch with its own responsibilities and dignity. Rather, they think of themselves as subordinate teammates on the president's team when the man of their party is in the White House. Second, I do think that the careerism of Congress and the intense re-election imperatives, fundraising and all the rest, have made them actually eager to shed more and more power to the executive so that they can get on to the business of getting reelected and to avoid the difficult decisions. Instead, what they do is they pass what they will smilingly call a law, saying we ought to have, say, a clean environment, and then they'll say, you guys in the executive agencies, you fill in the details, making all the difficult trade-offs that might get us in trouble. So there is a sense in which I think the quality of the legislator has declined considerably.
This feels like it's a trend everywhere that has legislatures, though, that the executive is sucking up power from the legislature. It certainly has. I mean, we have an entirely different system here, but even here you can see how much less impact individual members of parliament have over the direction of government anymore relative to the executive branch. It seems that it's the nature of our politics that everything gets centered around the individual at the heart of it, right?
That's exactly right. Politicians become individual entrepreneurs, raising their own campaign funds. The parties wither as important entities other than to organize these competitions. And you're quite right. It's happening in Ottawa. It's happening in Westminster and London. It's happening across the globe.
So you, in the book that you've written, talk about the departure of how progressives have driven government to a size and scope that is antithetical to the Second Amendment of the Constitution, providing people the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I studied in university a book by a guy named Samuel Huntington called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. He had the thesis that every revolution in America not revolution, but every tumult, whether it be the civil rights movement or the voting rights movement before that or any of these kinds of things, rights-seeking parties, unlike any other country where they are rebelling against the ethos of the country that they're in and want to change it, his thesis was that all of these things in the United States seek the rights that were promised to them by the Constitution. So they're all movements that appeal to the American dream for their rights, not reject the American dream for their rights.
You're absolutely right, and you are a fortunate person to have studied Sam Huntington. The American Constitution must be read in the light of the Declaration of Independence, which says government exists to secure, the crucial word in the Declaration, to secure our rights, which is why Woodrow Wilson, the first president to criticize the American founding, urged the American people not to read the first two paragraphs of the Declaration. He said it's just 4th of July boilerplate and it will only mislead you. In fact, the genius of Martin Luther King was to say that he was asking America to fulfill itself, not change itself. He was asking America to be true to promises made at the beginning. And once he succeeded with the political genius that he had in recasting the civil rights argument in terms of America fulfilling its long enunciated promises, he was on the way to victory. So, didn't women need active government to achieve the full promise of the Declaration of Independence? Well, they certainly needed the government to amend the Constitution to enfranchise women, that's for sure. It seems to me women have benefited, however, beyond that, far more by the openness of a market society and the dynamism and constant flux of capitalism than they have from any particular government program. So I could have somebody on here next who would say to me that it is absolutely essential for women to have their full rights as economic actors, that they have access to affordable childcare, for example. And your response would be? My response would be that, in fact, the private sector in the United States is going very far, very fast in providing child care, that there's no particular reason to believe that child care, which indeed is needed, has to be provided by government. That is the default position of progressives is, if there's a need, government must provide it. The default position of conservatives is, let's see if the market can supply what is demanded. because markets have a much better record than governments have in delivering services.
And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to use the word greed in it, and I don't mean it to apply to individuals. It's more of a concept. But in your book, I got the impression, there was a lot of concern about how a government had promised people life with no scarcity and life with no limits. And indeed, I want to talk to you about balanced budgets in a few minutes. But so that people had gotten accustomed to the fact that they could and should ask for anything from the state. So that's a form of public greed, I guess. What I'm interested in hearing you talk about is what's happened about private greed in our society. The wealthy are so much wealthier than they used to be, and they do so much less for the society around them than they used to in terms of providing good jobs with good benefits and pensions and caring about their community. Is not part of this breakup of the society you're looking for the fact that capital is partially destroying that solidarity of our society?
I'm not sure that's true. It seems to me that it's unnecessary to stigmatize as greed what might just be wholesome ambition and widespread self-interestedness. I speak to audiences all over the country, and I frequently ask, I said, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you have an Apple product in your pocket or purse? Hands go up, almost all of them. And say, well, how many have an Apple product at home? More hands go up. And then I say, now, how many of you are unhappy that Steve Jobs, the creator of Apple, died a billionaire? No hands go up. I don't think the American people resent what Steve Jobs' riches. And it seems to me a vast mistake to say that the large economic entities have not served the social interest. I mean, everyone now carries in their pocket an access to more information than is in the Library of Congress. We have an enormous connectivity produced by the market system that has produced these dazzling benefits. Social hypochondria is a constant failing in the West. The belief that things are bad and getting worse, when in fact things are actually quite good and getting better.
Well, I mean, I can see where you get that, and I have Apple products, and I love my Apple products. But I'm not sure that
it wasn't Steve Jobs' greed that did this. Steve Jobs had many motivations, but the idea that it was simply pecuniary greed strikes me as mistaken.
Okay, but when you want to start talking about taxing wealth or taxing high incomes to try to redistribute some money to what is an increasingly insecure middle and working class, people will talk to you about incentives. So we had marginal tax rates here in Canada that went up to the top marginal rate over 50%. And people in the business community and affluent members of society now started to talk about that as confiscation. It's over 50%. It's now confiscation. But, Jeff Bezos, if you had told Jeff Bezos when he was in his garage starting Amazon that the most he could ever make from Amazon was $50 billion, he'd have done it. He doesn't need $150 billion.
Well, that's his net worth because he owns stock in the company. But you talk about redistribution. The United States government does very little else than redistribute income. 67% of the federal budget is transfer payments. The skies over America are dark with checks flying back and forth from one claimant group to another. You talk about the wealthy. How progressive should tax be? The top 1% of American earners pay 39% of the income tax. The top 5% pay 60%. The top 10% pay 70% of the income tax. And listen to this. The bottom 50% of American earners pay the grand total of 3% of the income tax. Now, people find me a nation with a more progressive income tax than the United States has.
Well, it certainly wasn't the direction of recent tax reform, though.
No, it wasn't. And the tax reform has been followed by an enormous spurt of economic activity. We have now more than full employment. We have 7 million unfilled jobs. And people say, yes, but they've cut taxes for corporations. Yes, A, corporations happen to employ these people who are now at full employment. And B, Barack Obama wanted to cut the corporate income tax. It was an anomalous income tax, corporate tax in the United States, because it was way higher than the world average.
Well, actually, there's lots of economists who tell you that corporate taxes are kind of a bad idea to begin with. But
I think the proper corporate tax rate is zero.
But
because
politically,
we don't know who pays them.
Politically, that's impossible.
It is.
It's just, I think it's a bit of a natural segue now to something I really wanted to ask you about, which is, I always thought a bedrock idea of conservatism was fiscal responsibility. And the United States is now running a $1 trillion annual deficit.
At full employment, at 3% growth, yes. It's horrifying.
Right. And nobody even seems concerned about it. I don't sense any concern in the Republican Party about it, and I don't hear a Democratic candidate for president talking about it. It's over.
It is over. Look, for all the talk about discord in the United States, and Lord knows there's enough of that, what's most frightening about the political scene today is a consensus. It's a consensus in the political class from far left to far right. And the consensus is this: we should have a large, generous entitlement state and not pay for it. Everyone's agreed on that. The political class says, let's give the American people $1 worth of government and charge them 80 cents for it, and fob off the 20% of the cost of government onto the future generations, the unconsenting because unborn generations. We used to borrow money for the future, fought wars for the future, built roads, dams, harbors, airports for the future. Now we're borrowing money from the future to finance our own current consumption of government goods and services, and there's only one word for that, and it's decadent. And it is unsustainable over time, because when the next recession begins with trillion-dollar deficits, can you imagine what's going to happen to the society? When the next recession begins with very low interest rates, and therefore the Federal Reserve cannot ward off the inflation by cutting interest rates, can you imagine what's going to happen? Now, some people say, well, we're not going to have any more recessions. If the current president had abolished the business cycle, his native modesty would not have prevented him from mentioning it.
So, if that's where we've ended up, from the conservative sensibility to what you've just described, in your view, what's been lost?
What's been lost is, first of all, a sense of civic propriety, the idea that one should loot future generations for our own convenience. What has been lost is a sense of self-control. Governance of the self is the beginning of self-government. That has been lost. Furthermore, the idea of institutional responsibilities has been lost. The idea that Congress, which has its fundamental job is to budget and can't pass a budget, is an evidence of simply institutional dysfunction across the board in the United States.
Do you think the conservatism you subscribe to is electorally viable? Could somebody get elected in the United States on that kind of an approach?
It's very difficult. Once you explain to the political class that they can prosper by, again, giving the American people cheap, artificially cheap government, and the people love it. I mean, they're not going to complain. It's very hard to make this palatable. I'm afraid what is needed is the hard instruction of a crisis, and I'm afraid one is bound to come.
Yeah, well, that in a number of different forms it could come. I don't want to ask you to talk too much about Trump unless you feel the need to, because you're pretty much on the record about what you think about him. What I'm perhaps interested in is whether you think he is an anomaly, or does he represent something more fundamentally wrong with the United States. And I, as a Canadian, am curious always to this day about how Americans watched him campaign for a year and a half and then elected him, and now have watched him govern for 2.5 years. And as you were talking about on the panel the other day, he's got a steady 43 to 46% approval rating among Americans. How can anybody watch him and approve of him?
Well, you're asking the wrong person on that. But I would say the following. Look, one victory is an anomaly. 2 victories is a pattern. So we're going to learn a lot about the United States in 2020. Remember, 78,000 votes, which is a drop in the bucket. 78,000 votes spread over 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, produced this. Remember, he lost the popular vote by 5 times more than George W. Bush lost the popular vote to Al Gore in the 2000 election. So there was an element of fluke here. Until 2016, the United States had never had a major party candidate enter the general election in the fall campaign with higher disapproval ratings than approval ratings. Right. In 2016, it had 2 of them. Now, if you want to produce bizarre and unexpected outcomes, just do that. Present the American people with a really unpleasant choice, and you're apt to have an unpleasant outcome.
Okay, but say he lost. Say Hillary Clinton's the president today, and Trump got 45% of the vote. What does that say?
That says that there are a fair number of people are dismayed by the sense that they are being left out of the party, if you will, that the country is prospering, but they are not. And it's not just material deprivation that they're feeling and material dislocation from the cold winds of globalization. It's also a sense that they're being looked down upon, that they're being condescended to by coastal elites, if you will, and the media and academia and Hollywood and all the rest. So there is a culture war dimension to this.
That's what I was trying to get at.
How much of that can be diffused by economic growth remains to be seen.
Well, not all of it, I don't think.
I don't either.
I'm certainly think I'm noticing, Mr. Will, both in Canada and in the United States, a real backlash among white men, particularly white men without college educations, because they feel that almost every trend in society is stripping them of power and status. There's
no question that the modern economy, which rewards cognitive abilities, is producing a cognitively stratified society in which the rewards go to what we call people possessing what we call human capital, information, education, the ability to manipulate data and ideas. 200 years ago in the United States, and probably true in Canada as well, the great source of wealth was land. We in the United States had so much of it, we were giving it away. Turn of the 20th century, the great source of wealth was heavy fixed capital. Think of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills or Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad. Today, the great source of wealth is mind, information, education. And there's simply no way that even universal free public education, even if it's done well, which it rarely is, can equalize the ability of people to add value to the modern economy. Well, by definition, half of the people have a below-average IQ. Therefore, they're unlikely to be globally competitive at what they're doing. This is exactly right, and this is the great challenge. And it's going to get worse when you get certain artificial intelligence and other matters coming into play. Let me give you one example. The largest job category in the United States is driver. It is the largest category of job in 39 of the 50 states. What is going to happen when, 5 to 10 years from now, we have an enormous number of autonomous vehicles on the road? That's just one kind of dislocation we're facing. I know. The combination of globalization and automation is going to be, and this is why, if we could talk for another half an hour, I would talk to you about how we solve problems like that without active government, but maybe we can do that another day. We're out of time. I want to ask you one last question, which is,
who is the best president you've covered and why?
Reagan, because he responded to exactly what the country needed at the time, which was a jolt of confidence. The inflation and stagflation of the 1970s had caused the country, coming as it did after Vietnam and Watergate, an enormous crisis of confidence. And he came along with a spring in his step, and he put a spring in the country's step.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your time. The book is fabulous. I encourage everybody to go out there and read it. Your appreciation of politics, no matter what your perspective, will be better for it. And Mr. Will, may our paths cross again.
I hope so. I enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye. That was really interesting. George Will is a public intellectual for many decades who's given a tremendous amount of thought to conservative ideology and to the governance of the United States. Didn't know, as he mentioned to me before the podcast, that he lived in Toronto and taught at the University of Toronto for a couple of years and has a strong appreciation for Canada. His new book, which is just came out last month, Conservative Sensibility, is a really good read. And if you're not a conservative and if you don't think he understands the world in its entirety, it's an important perspective to understand, even if your mind takes you in a different direction. So we're going to continue this commentary in the weeks ahead with discussions with economist Jim Stanford, leading Canadian business person Michael McCain, and others. So check back into the Herle Burly for a continuation of this discussion about how we navigate our way politically through different economic times, different social times, different geopolitical times. We're going to have as many interesting people on here to talk about it as we can. As always, if you liked the show, please give us a rating or a reference either on iTunes or Stitcher or on social media somewhere. As many people as we can get to listen to this podcast, the better, and you can help us. So thank you very much.